This is the RPG Pundit, the final boss in Internet Shitlords. And today I'm talking with you about what I suppose is a fairly non-controversial subject, which is how to run a really long D&D or OSR or RPG campaign. And I bring this up because I recently posted on Twitter that my Dungeon Crawl Classics campaign, Dungeon Crawl Classics, an incredible OSR game, by the way, that is a more gonzo version of D&D, you could say, that pushes everything up to 11. It's fantastically fun to play. It's just unbelievably fun to play. I had nothing to do with making it, so yeah, you can't even say that I'm just shilling or something like that. I have nothing to do with making it. I make no money from Dungeon Crawl Classics, but it is, aside from any of the games I've made myself, probably my favorite game, period. So I've been posting on Twitter that my DCC campaign has now been running for 6 years. It just had its 6th birthday party. We had cake, there were presents and everything. And a lot of people were astounded by that. Somebody said that the RPG Pundit's DCC campaign is older than 2 of my 3 kids. And that's true, I guess, but it's not even the longest campaign I've ever run. The longest campaign I've ever run has been about 10 years. So, and I've had several campaigns that have reached 6 years. None of which were quite as fun at the 6-year mark as Dungeon Crawl Classics is and continues to be. That's the campaign that I regularly post campaign updates to on my blog. When people in the comments here ask why I haven't killed Catboy yet or mentioned Bill the Elf, they're talking about that campaign. My Last Son series of RPG Pundit Presents source books. Oh, there you go, I am shilling. The Last Son series of RPG Pundit Presents source books are all based on the campaign of DCC that I've been running and the weird gonzo world that I've set it in. And so it's been a tremendous creative outlet and a tremendous outlet in general of, excellent gaming, really excellent gaming. But for example, my original Dark Albion campaign, the first one I ran, it ran for 6 years too. So this is not by any means unique for me. And I tend to run long campaigns. In fact, for me, in between long campaigns, I'll tend to run a short campaign. And a short campaign means one that runs for about 6 months of playing once every 2 weeks. So that's a short campaign. Okay. For a lot of you listening, for a lot of D&D gamers out there, even ones that have been playing for more than just a year or two, 6 months might seem maybe like an impossible amount of time to be playing a campaign. It would seem like it would be the longest campaign you've ever played. But here's the thing, and I've said this before, an RPG campaign doesn't really become what it's meant to be. You haven't really had the optimal gaming experience with RPGs until after you've been playing for at least a couple of years in the same setting and with more or less the same characters. Of course, characters can come and go, but you've been developing that campaign in regular actual play for 2 years. And a lot of the things that we see in the new school today, that it gets pushed by people, the stuff that I call things they're teaching you wrong on purpose about D&D, are things that are meant to somehow substitute the necessity for that, right? It's like, oh, you should make really detailed backgrounds for your characters. Well, the reason that you have to do that is because you're not going to play those characters long enough for them to become actually alive instead of just the lifelikeness of playing characters that you've made detailed backgrounds for, right? The best detailed background that you can possibly make for a character is to play him for 3 or 4 years. And then he's going to have a really detailed background by that point. He'll be hugely detailed in a way that's much more organic and that feels way less fake than anything you would write up before you've even known the character, before you've created it, okay? So how do you get there, though? How do you get to the point where you are able to run a campaign that lasts 6 years? Here are a few tips and tricks from a guy who's done it many, many times already. I don't know exactly how many. I think I've had at least 5 or 6 campaigns that have hit the 6-year marks. And most of my campaigns, unless I make them intentionally set out to be short, don't run less than 3 years, right? So this is my advice from someone who's done it, who knows how to do it, and who's done it regularly. The first thing I tell you is that what you need is a dedicated group of players. Now, they don't always all have to keep being the same players all through, but you need to have some kind of a core, and that will be people who you know are going to be coming on a regular basis. So you have to start out being a little selective about who you invite. That's a general rule. There are exceptions to that rule. For example, in my Dark Albion campaign, right, I had a group of really dedicated players who had played with me for a long time. They knew this was going to be a long game. They knew it was going to play through the entire period of the Rose War, the 35 years of the fantasy version of the War of the Roses. And this was all stuff that they were okay with. So that's how it went, right? And they were people that I knew that I could count that, barring personal emergencies or whatever, were going to show up every 2 weeks to come and play for the period that we had set as the time for play. You have to be consistent. That's another very important point. That's maybe even more important, is that you say, okay, this is the day we're playing, these are the hours we're playing, and we're always going to do it. Okay? The only exception being if there's some catastrophe where you have less than a critical amount of players, right? Like in my case, I generally say if there's 3 players or more plus the DM, then we will play. If something happens where more than, where there's less than 3 players that can even actually come that day, okay, well then we're gonna have to cancel it that time, right? So this is, like I said, this is the rule, but the rules can have exceptions, because, for example, my DCC campaign had a very different tack. And the difference between the two is that the Dark Albion campaign was meant to be a very serious campaign, lots of intense role-playing, lots of intense character development. It was a serious world. There was, it was like Game of Thrones, something like that, right? Whereas Dungeon Crawl Classics was this gonzo game. It was meant to be very lighthearted, and I did something completely the opposite of what I normally do. But this is the exception. That's not going to work so well unless you're already a really good DM. So what I did in this case with Dungeon Crawl Classics is I said, this is a really relaxing. I still made it hard and fast the date and time that we're playing. We were playing, every Sundays from 3 to 10, right? But I told people, look, here, unlike my other campaigns, you can't make it, don't show up. Doesn't matter, right? If we got enough people to play, we'll play. If we don't, we don't. And so this meant that we had players that could come and try to play for a couple times. If it didn't suit them, they'd leave. We'd get others that would come and join the campaign. And we started building up until we got a core group of people, the people that we mostly have there now, who are people that are playing all the way through. The only guy who has been playing from the very start of those 6 years, apart from myself, is the player who plays Bill the Elf. And the others all came in at different periods over time, and then they're the ones who stuck. And there were a few other people who were very dedicated players too, but who had to quit for one reason or another. This allowed the campaign to continue surviving through that. But I'm warning you right now that that's going to be a little less likely to succeed unless you at least start with a couple players that you know are going to be stalwarts, that you know are going to be coming on a regular basis, that are going to be really reliable. If not, you're going to have trouble. Shaking my coffee there. All right, so that was what I did with Dungeon Crawl Classics. You can try that, but I think you're better off being very consistent about player attendance. Now, in either case, what you want to do also is you want to have a general framework for your campaign without planning out every detail of your campaign. Work on planning out the world very carefully. There's one thing that Dark Albion has in common with the World of the Last Sun, which is the setting I use for Dungeon Crawl Classics. In every other respect, they're pretty much different. Dark Albion is very low magic, very gritty. It's literally based on actual history. Like you're playing in Europe in the 1450s to the 1480s. You're playing characters in that world with those religious values, with all of the standard social class, and it's very mundane. If you have to go out to the wilderness to find really weird, wonderful stuff, because the central areas are the realms of men. They're where you don't see a lot of magic every day or things like that, right? So it's a very low magic thing, and it focused on the fighting between the noble houses during the Rose War and this whole again, a Game of Thrones kind of vibe. Whereas my Last Sun campaign is an insane world set millions of years in the future, set tens of thousands of years after a disaster, with a mishmash of just about anything you can imagine thrown in there, right? It's completely gonzo. And just bizarre and very funny, and it seems to the player, it's going to seem like kind of unpredictable in ways. But I have in it an internal logic, right? That everything that's there, I have an explanation for why it's there. So the main thing that they had in common is that in both cases, I worked really hard to develop what were the rules of that world and what was the starting point of the campaign, what I envisioned as the starting point, what I imagined to be the ending point of the campaign long in the future. That could still, that can change because obviously the player characters might end up changing the campaign for you. But you want to have those two. And then in the middle, you do not want to have, as a rule, again, you can make exceptions, but as a rule, you do not want to have like a really strict regulated series of events that you're leading the players from one to the other. A way to get around that is, for example, what you can have is a timeline, right? In the Dark Albion book, you see a timeline of events of what happens between 1455 and 1485, where major events are detailed, right? Those major events aren't necessarily stuff that your players are going to be there when they happen. They're just going to be stuff that's happening around them. And in some cases, it might be that they're going to be right in the middle of it, but they're going to be involved in it, right? In other cases, they might be off doing other stuff, doing other missions for their lord or on their own, or digging into barrow mounds or any kind of thing, right? In my Dungeons & Crawl Classics game, what I did is I actually had set up the starting place of the world as a relatively limited area, which was the area around the rose dome of the hipster elves, and the wilderness around there. I'd had a recent disaster that explains how the players get together, which was that there was a zombie plague that wiped out almost all the humans in that part of the continent, and the player characters started as refugees that trick their way into the rose dome and then have to deal with the incredibly annoying hipster elves and save them from themselves until they finally get tired of it and just let them all be destroyed because they're useless. So that was the start of the campaign. That one I had a number of kind of adventures plans set out in a very general sense. But what you don't want to be doing is meticulously detailing careful adventures pre-planned. That's a great thing to do for a one-shot where you're going to be playing for 6 hours or 8 hours or whatever, and you want to have every room in the dungeon filled in, you want to have everything planned. In a campaign, sometimes you can do that, but you don't want to do that for everything because the campaign's going to need to be adjusting to what goes on beyond that, right? So make sure you have set times to play, make sure you have reliable people to play with, and make sure you have a kind of general idea of what your campaign world is like, of what its rules are, right? Like how, if you were making a source book about your campaign world, maybe you're going to be playing in one that somebody else wrote, and that's fine too. But make sure you really understand what are the basic details of that campaign world. What are the tropes of it? What are what's the genre of it? And what's it about? And then when you're actually playing, what you're going to want to do is do not, don't listen to people say, oh, you have to let the players lead. What should be happening is really that nothing leads except what you could call the inevitable course of history, right? The players will make choices, and those choices that the player characters are making in the world will lead them into places, and there will be events that'll go around that. And, depending on who they end up working for or where they end up living at or what they end up, doing for a job, you then have to make adventures that will kind of fit into that. But, you don't want them to be filling in details about the world. And you don't want everything that happens in the world to be about them, because to make a long-term campaign, the world has to come alive. And it doesn't feel like a living world if it revolves around the player characters. The player characters can end up being very, very powerful and important people in that world. But if they get the feeling that the whole world is there for them, that everything happens in reaction to stuff that they do, then your world is never going to come alive. And what you need to do instead is create what I call a cast of thousands. Have all kinds of NPCs, have all kinds of places, and when there are places, you think to yourself about the people who might be in those places. You give them personalities, even sometimes very minor characters. You make sure you understand what their motivations are, and you think about what they do as a reaction to how they interact with the PCs, but also stuff that they do that has nothing to do with the PCs. You know, what matters to them, what's important to them, what are they working on themselves, right? And when you're talking about, you know, major heroes or major villains of your campaign world that aren't the PCs, that's going to become super important, because hopefully your PCs will also have their own priorities, and sometimes those priorities are going to collide right into the priorities of the major NPCs, right? And then, you know, along with that, you also want to throw in some events that are not caused by the PCs and cannot be solved by the PCs. That's a big part of making a living world, but that the PCs might have to live with after that, might have to react to after that, right? You see, you know, just to give you an example, right, in the history of England, you had, you know, Richard the Lionhearted gets taken down by a lucky crossbow shot, right? King Henry V, the hero of Agincourt, the Lion of Britain, right, this great king. And, you know, he gets sick and dies when he was still in his absolute prime, and there was nothing that anyone could do. And this starts a disaster because his heir is like months old. He's not even a year old. And so you end up with the whole situation that leads up to the War of the Roses, right? In the War of the Roses itself, spoilers here in case you're playing in it, you have Richard of York, the great hero of the White Rose, and he's kicking ass everywhere, and then he makes one bad choice in a battle and gets himself killed, right? It's that, again, George R.R. Martin ripped everything off of the Rose, you know, the War of the Roses. all that crazy stuff in Game of Thrones, and that sort of element of there being stuff that just happens that you never would have expected, because that's what history is like, right? Don't make a story with your world, make a history. Those are two very different things. A story is in a fake setting that you're using to tell a tale, whether it's a morality tale or whether it's just a fanciful tale, a fairy tale, or whether it's you know, just political propaganda disguised as narrative or whatever. That's a story. But when stuff happens and it's just like happening for real in the world, and therefore is not always going to be, you know, it's not going to feel the same as a novel. A history doesn't feel the same as a novel unless a novelist is writing it as a pseudo-history, which is what you see, for example, again, in something like Game of Thrones. You have instead a bunch of events that happen because of people doing things plus random and unexpected events, right? In my Dark Albion book, I have a table of random events that happen when you go into a new city, right? Or when you've come back to a city from a long time, right? And you can just kind of add those in. And you can also do stuff like that on bigger scales to see, you know, well, what's changed? What's happened that year, right? What's going on that nobody expected to happen, right? Maybe there's a terrible fire in the city, and maybe it's not like evil goblins or something like that. Maybe it's just that someone dropped a candle, right? And this sort of stuff will kind of twist and turn the way of your world, right? In my Dungeon Crawl Classics game, the players were really they made certain choices that in each step led them to the next place that they went to, right? And the world of my Last Sun campaign is vast, right? So they started out over there in the Rose Dome, and then when the Rose Dome was wrecked, part of what they did is that they betrayed the hipster elves and got some powerful old wizards who wanted to take over the dome to teleport them off to somewhere, to some big city full of humans. That's what they wanted. So they went to Arkholm, right? And then they played a whole long campaign period, like about a year, in the city of Arkholm, which is this grungy, weird city built on the inside of a canyon that is clearly, you know, made of towers built in the shells of old rocket ships. And it's full of these different gangs that are fighting for power and all these very interesting NPCs. So all those people they met, things got developed, the players got involved. They killed major NPCs, they made allegiances with others, they discovered new people. Bill the Elf's brother Ted died there at the hands of a wizard named Nikos, who is still his, you know, he still wants to kill for that, and that's where he turned, you know, Bill turned into the psychotic lunatic that we all know and love today. And then at some point, they realized that they had to get out of Arkholm because things were going badly for them. And so they made a run for it, and they went to the next place, heading, you know, they said, let's go east, right? And they crossed the Sea of Sand, and then they ended up in the gnarly forest and found other fascinating characters, right? So you have to, they've been kind of moving around on their own impetus, but there have also been a whole bunch of events along the way, right? Like they didn't decide, what these gangs in Arkham were up to. They didn't decide, about Nikos was literally, he's an incredibly powerful, insane wizard that, randomly turns people into stuff. So like, he was literally a walking, living, superpowered random event. And that's another thing. If you want your campaign to prosper, I strongly advise you make use of random tables, because you are not as clever as you think you are. And randomness, now remember, when you roll on a random table, you don't always have to do what it says, but it can lead you to like look at the result and think of something you never would have thought of otherwise, right? So make use of that as a creative aid that will lead you to think up better stuff than you're going to think up just by thinking it, right? Because for the most part, very few of us are going to imagine a story that's going to be better than a history, and history has randomness in it. Your story won't have randomness in it. It'll just have what you've thought up. So make sure you make your campaign world come alive and give your players ample opportunity to interact with that living world and with all the characters in it. And don't give them everything they want all at once. Just let them struggle and end up winning for themselves, right? And let them end up getting to where they're trying to go, whether they know that's where they're going or not. Through their own efforts and through their own suffering. Let some characters die. Don't make the world revolve around them. Let them see if they have the will to power to get there on their own, and that's going to make for a very successful campaign. So I hope these few tips, I'm sure there's a lot more. Tell me in the comments what you think, if you've managed to play long-term campaigns, what you think makes it happen. I'll give you one more little point here. A lot of people who play short campaigns play games with their friends, right? Like they want their friends to be the people at the table. And it's perfectly fine to play games with your friends. But a lot of times when you're playing games with your friends, it's not really about the game. It's about getting together with your friends. And that's an ideal situation for running a one-shot dungeon or something like that. You all have fun, you eat Cheetos, whatever, and everybody's happy. If what you want to have is a long-term campaign, they can be friends of yours or acquaintances, or they can be people that you just know from some gaming club or that you contacted online or whatever. But the people you want are going to be people who are there first and foremost to play the game, so that you don't get derailed into distractions, right? Like you're coming that night. You might be good friends and do stuff at other times, but that night that you're gaming, you're coming there to game, and the game is the focus. And all the people who are involved have to understand that and participate on those terms. If you can do that, then that's going to be a big deal. So let us know what you think. Tell us in the comments. And if you like this video, please subscribe if you haven't subscribed yet. We're inching ever closer to 1,000 subscribers. And when we do, I'm going to start doing more frequent posting here. Hit the notification bell so that YouTube doesn't hide my posts. And share this video absolutely everywhere. And if any of what I've said sounds interesting to you, well, feel free to check out my products. That's a great way to support me. And my products are, if I say so myself, really great. Check out Dungeon Crawl Classics too. It's not mine. I didn't have anything to do with it, but it is one hell of a game. It's just amazing. But yeah, check out my all my Dark Albion, Lion and Dragon, Cults of Chaos, and the RPG Pundit Presents series. Half of the RPG Pundit Presents series is about medieval authentic role-playing, and the other half is Gonzo. So there you are. If you want to help me directly, give me encouragement to keep making more videos and to make them with more frequency. You want to help donate to the Let's Kill the Catboy Fund, then put some money into my PayPal, which you can find on my blog. There's a PayPal button on the right-hand side, or support me on Patreon. But mainly, and most importantly, as far as I'm concerned, share the video. Let's build up the channel. Right? Okay, so thank you very much. And currently smoking Brigham Anniversary Pipe plus Image Latakia.